This episode of Primitive Culture is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and to help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm.
And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the non-profit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org.
And if you want to join the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode, join the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field. We look forward to seeing you there.
This is Tim Russ, Lieutenant Commander Tuvok on Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Open your mind to the past. Oh, this may mean something.
I've been coerced into watching tonight's movie.
You do have books in the 24th century.
It's a primitive culture. I'm just trying to blend in.
Some people think the future means the end of history. We haven't run out of history quite yet.
Hello and welcome to Primitive Culture, a Trek FM podcast all about our history, our culture, and how Star Trek relates to it. I'm Duncan Barrett, and joining me today, I have another wonderful guest from across the network. It's Brandon-Shea Mutala. Hi, Brandon. How are you?
I'm doing wonderful, and I'm really happy to be here. But, oh, man, your room, it's such a disaster. It's such a mess, but I love it. I want to buy that room and just fix it up.
Yeah, well, it could take a bit of work. Although you never know, you might get if you have a bit of magic help fixing my room up. That could definitely help. I could do with a haunted room that cleans itself, I think. What about you? Yours looks pretty tidy. You've obviously been working on yours.
Yes, mine's definitely clean, and that's because I have a very controlling mother who keeps my house very nice.
Well, there you go. Well, listeners, I think if anyone's guessed the subject of this podcast from that cryptic exchange, then, you know, they deserve a prize, probably. But what Brandon's coming on the show today to talk about is a film that I have to say I'd never even heard of until Brandon brought it to me. I know, I'm sorry, I hold my hands up. But, you know, that's the great thing about having guests on Primitive Culture is I get to learn about new stuff. And this is the John Carpenter film, 1983 film Christine, which inspired the Voyager episode Alice. Now, I have to say, I've spoken to a few people this week and mentioned I was doing this podcast, and they were like, Alice, what's that? You know, I've seen Voyager. I don't even remember the Voyager episode. But maybe, Brandon, you could, since you were the one who brought this idea to me, you could sort of kick off by just giving the listeners a little bit of an intro to, broadly speaking, what this film and, of course, the book that it was inspired by are about and how that ties into the Voyager episode.
Well, Christine is a Stephen King novel that came out in the early 80s, and you know, I've always loved the book. I've read it once before, but it's been a long time since I read it. I read it 20-some years ago. And basically what it is this it's about young teenage boys, you know, this love triangle between a boy, his car, and his girlfriend. And this guy falls in love with this car. He wants to buy it. And it turns out that kind of the car is haunted. There's a little bit more to that in the novel, and the book was translated into film by John Carpenter, who is one of the greats in cinema, and you know he specializes in horror films, and you know on Twitter his handle is The Horror Master, and you know it is one of those underrated films, and I've always loved the movie, and I've seen the movie way more than I've seen the book, and recently, you know, I guess it's not so recent anymore. But back in 2016, when we did our Trek FM rewatch and I got to Alice again, I'm like, holy smokes, this is just Christine in 45 minutes is what this is.
With a new paint job, basically, yeah.
Yeah. So I watched Christine again with my wife after that, and I'm like, I totally want to get on a podcast on the network and talk about this, you know, just because I love Christine so much. I'm not that big of a fan of Alice itself. You know, like I like Voyager, and I talk about Voyager quite a bit. It's not my favorite Trek series, but I find it fun to talk about cinema because I really love watching movies, but I find it fun to talk about the cinema that has influenced episodes of Star Trek. Over on Warp 5, which is my Star Trek Enterprise podcast, we're doing a couple of different things. I've watched a couple of movies that have inspired episodes. I did an episode with John Tenuto on Enemy Mine, and how that's very similar to the episode Dawn from Enterprise. And then we also had some guests on. We talked about the Magnificent Seven and the episode Marauders, because those are very similar. And so this is an extension of the type of things that I like to discuss on the network, and when it comes to Star Trek. So, in a nutshell, that's basically it. Yeah.
It's absolutely right up our alley as well, right up our dark, seedy back alley with a sinister car creeping down. That's one of the scenes I did really like in the film, which I can't remember whether it plays out slightly differently in the novel, because there are a few things that were changed to make them sort of more cinematic or more dramatic or whatever. Is this basically sort of homicidal car? Spoilers if you're going to go and watch this film, you probably work this out by looking at the box. The car starts killing people, and there's one scene where this guy is running away from the car, and it gets down. He runs down what seems like a kind of narrow enough alleyway that the car won't be able to fit. But because this car is so deranged and evil, it just crunches itself to bits to kind of get down there and smash him to pieces, and then sort of reverses out in a complete wreck. And through the kind of evil magic that it's possessed with, the car is able to sort of heal itself. So one of the things I think works really well in the film is that you get these scenes of the kind of crumpled, damaged car sort of uncrumpling itself in a sense, like kind of regenerating itself. The only thing I'd say though is what I felt was not clear from the film. I mean, I think it's just it's quite a big book, the Stephen King book. It's like a 500 odd page book, and the film is like a, reasonably tight kind of horror film. In the book, it's much clearer, I think, that the car is kind of feeding off Arnie, the guy who's bought it, this kind of slightly hopeless teenager who he buys this car, and at one level it changes him. It gives him this kind of sort of machismo almost. It makes him popular. It clears up his acne. It makes him a kind of a cool guy, basically. But at the same time, it's also draining him. It's making him age. It's kind of, which is partly there's this kind of suggestion that it's turning him into the car's previous owner, or that they're kind of, their personalities are kind of merging in some way. But also the sense that it's almost like a kind of succubus draining him. And you do get that, I guess, in the Voyager episode, certainly towards the end, where Paris he's stubbly, he's looking tired, he's got those things, almost like Borg kind of things, sticking into him and kind of somehow draining him. Everyone seems to be saying, you need to go to bed, you need to sleep, you're kind of, this is having an impact on you. So I guess some of that is there in the Voyager episode. And I think you're right. I mean, certainly if you have seen the film Christine, or even read the book, watching that Voyager episode, it's kind of inescapable. And actually it's interesting. I was looking into some of the kind of background behind the writing of this episode. It was a freelance pitch, I think, but it was written by, the teleplay was by Brian Fuller and Michael Taylor. And but both Brian Fuller and Kenneth Biller later said that they were quite disappointed by it. And I think it's not a great Star Trek episode by any stretch of the imagination. But I was quite interested what Brian Fuller said. He said it was his least favourite episode that season. But he said we did too direct of a translation. And basically he felt that they hadn't, rather than allowing the Stephen King story or the John Carpenter film to kind of inspire them to do something original, they kind of just lifted it and translated it across. And in many ways, something that works for Stephen King or something that works for John Carpenter isn't necessarily going to work for Voyager. And really, it would have been better if they'd been a bit more creative with that story, really, rather than just kind of copying A to B. And it is true, certainly in the Voyager, there are lots of even directly lifted scenes. So, for example, there's a scene where the guy who's bought the car is supposed to be going out with his friend to the cinema, and he lets him down. And in the Voyager episode, we have a scene where the same thing happens with Tom and Harry. They're meant to be going on the holodeck. Paris makes a little joke about someone wiping the odometer back on the shuttle that he's got hold of, which is literally what happens in the book and the film. It starts rolling backwards. And then there's even a kind of visual reference to the film, I think, because in the scene where B'Elanna gets suffocated within the shuttle, it's not just that this is similar to something that happens in the book where the character, Arnie's girlfriend, Lee, starts choking on a burger. I think she starts choking on whatever she's eating. But in the film of Christine, there's literally almost the exact same shot that we see of B'Elanna in the Voyager episode, where she's inside the car, he's outside, she's got her hand up to the glass, and she's kind of, silently, desperately, unable to breathe. And so they even went so far, I think, in terms of the way that scene was directed, of kind of borrowing that visual in a way. So it's kind of almost inescapable. If you're familiar with that story, although it isn't explicitly acknowledged anywhere on screen, you kind of can't get away from it. And I wonder do you think that's part of the reason that Voyager episode doesn't work so well, that it's too indebted to Christine?
See, that's interesting, because that's what works for me in this episode, is that it is so similar to the film. And I kind of like seeing those episodes that are inspired by film. So while I don't think the episode itself is very memorable or great. What I do like about it is the fact that it is a callback to this film, Christine, which is such a classic. And it is a great translation to Voyager because Tom Paris is the perfect character for this story. You know, he's got the relationship with B'Elanna. He's the guy that loves cars. He's the guy that loves that retro stuff. It's a great translation, and I'm surprised somebody didn't come up with it sooner in it, you know? So it seems to work for me. And the episode is more of an adaptation of the film than the book. Because, like, when you get into the book, you know, I don't quite understand in the novel what the origin is of the hauntedness of the car, right? Because in the movie, it's clear that this car is haunted from the get-go, right? So there's something wrong with this car. It's haunted right at the beginning, coming off the assembly line. The hood smashes on that guy's hand and somebody dies inside the car on the assembly line. Where in the book, that's not the case. In the book, the car is not haunted. The car becomes haunted with the previous owner's soul. And it's the previous owner that's using Arnie as a way to, you know, live again and live with this car again. And as he got old, the car got old. And so now that Arnie's young again, he's rejuvenating himself. So in the book, it's clear that it's Raleigh LeBay that's the haunt. Where in the movie, it's clear that it's the car. And in the episode, it's the space shuttle in that there's some type of artificial intelligence in it that's, you know, working with Tom. But what I like about the episode, though, is the fact that Tom is kind of like connected to this even when he's not. And they'll have like the camera moving and you'll see that Tom's not talking to anybody. And then the camera will spin around and then all of a sudden there's this female representation of the spaceship that he's talking directly to. And it's like he's talking to a person. And, you know, again, in the book, there's a couple of scenes where Arnie's in the car with the ghost of Raleigh LeBay and they're communicating and whatnot. So, you know, there's a little bit of everything that's been pulled together in this episode, which is fun. It's fun.
It does. I mean, you're right. The book, I mean, it's interesting looking into this. I really enjoyed the book and I really enjoyed the film as well. For me, I found the book more effective because I felt that it was actually quite scary. Whereas I felt like the film, albeit a horror film, I think there's a real challenge of making a car scary as a kind of villain. And in a way, Stephen King, for me, is able to manage that through harnessing the reader's imagination in a way that John Carpenter, brilliant director as he was, you know, he himself actually said, I found a quote, he said, "I enjoyed working with the actors on this film, but I spent too much time with that damned car and it was difficult to make it frightening." And he said, you know, at least in Duel, they had a truck, but all I had was this, you know, rather snazzy looking 1950s car. And so I suppose that's one element of it that for me, the book kind of worked better than the film. I know a lot of people feel the other way around. I mean, a lot of people hated this book. They thought it was a complete mess. Apparently, Stephen King was high on drugs most of the time he was writing it. And there are a lot of things in the book that arguably don't quite go anywhere. The structure is a bit ramshackle. And questions like that, you know, where did the evil in this car spring from? Because you're right, there's a lot of emphasis on Roland LeBay, the previous owner. On the other hand, it seems like the car has functioned as a kind of, you know, succubus or whatever to him as well, insofar that it's affected his life. And it's also kind of, I don't know whether it's aged him exactly, but it's had similar effects on him as it had on Arnie. So that does sort of suggest that there was something going back before he encountered the car. But apparently when they were making the film, they actually rang up Stephen King and said, look, can you clarify for us, was this car born evil or did something happen? And he basically said, yeah, I don't know, you know, you make it up, I don't care really. So that was the kind of idea of like how invested Stephen King was in kind of making it all, sort of tying up all the loose ends. But to me, that didn't really bother me reading the book. I just found it very engrossing and very kind of compulsive. And a lot of people have likened that novel to junk food. They've said, you know, there's this accusation that Stephen King writes junk food and that's not junk, you know, junk literature. And that's not always true. But with this one, maybe it is. But at the same time, I found it very pleasurable and very kind of a thrilling read. And the film as well, I enjoyed. What I'd say is like the Voyager episode, I don't think it hits any of that. I suppose because it's not scary. They can't really do horror. And it's also got this central problem, I think, that I was reading, I don't know if you ever read Darren Mooney's reviews. He writes these long reviews of various Star Trek episodes, and he wrote one about this episode that I thought was quite interesting. And he was basically saying he thought the problem was this is a novel that is really all about sex and sexuality and kind of these weird relationship between the man and his car, and this kind of there's got two love triangles in it, because it's got the love triangle between the two male characters in the novel, the protagonist and the narrator, plus the sort of love interest. And then it's also got the whole sort of sexualization of the car that's given a female name and that's kind of likened to women in various ways. But that basically Voyager can't really handle any of that, because it's very kind of clean and, you know, prime time and sort of, you know, this is Star Trek and it's the future. So it's got this kind of weird mix where the woman character who plays Alice in the Voyager episode, she does do the sort of seductive voice and everything. You know, there's this scene where she's kind of calling to Tom like a sort of siren or something. She's almost like the Borg Queen calling to Picard or whatever. But at the same time, there's nothing sexy between them. I mean, there's this kind of suggestion that he's cheating on B'Elanna with this shuttle, and even at the end of the episode, the last line pretty much, I think, is he makes this joke about he and the Delta Flyer are just friends. You know, he's not going to have any more affairs with weird vehicles. But at the same time, there's no real kind of sexual energy between them. Do you know what I mean? And part of that maybe is because it's Voyager and it all has to be quite tame and quite kind of clean. Whereas the Stephen King is so sort of scrunchy and weird and twisted and sort of perverse. And none of that can really translate. So what you get is a translation of the most sort of basic level, but you don't get all the kind of interesting, gritty baggage that goes along with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with you 100%. And it is a limitation of the medium. It is a limitation of what they wanted to do with Voyager. And it is a limitation of the characters. You know, I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I don't find Robbie Duncan McNeil all that sexy, you know? Like, I don't know. That could just be me.
Well, even with the stubble.
Even with the stubble, yes.
Oh.
So, and then also, like I've mentioned before, problematic, I am not that big of a fan of the relationship that he has with B'Elanna. I know that people think it's the greatest thing ever. I think they hit it way on the head too much, and they force us to believe that they love each other, you know? Like, you get into the episodes like I think it's the Killing Game, when they're doing the Nazi World War II stuff, and Workforce, where it's like, oh, Tom and B'Elanna are such star-crossed lovers. Even when they're out of their minds, they love each other. You know, even when they don't know who they are, they love each other. And I'm like, that just doesn't work for me, that they have to hit it on the head that much. It just doesn't work for me. But, you know, I'm a miserable old coot, right? So, but, you know, this book, I really love the novel. It might be my favorite Stephen King novel. Like, I really love it. I think it's really well written. And while not everything is paid off in the novel, I kind of really like that, because the novel is structured in a very interesting way. And I've never read a book like this. So the book is in 3 parts, and the first and the third part are in first person point of view of his friend. He's the main narrator of it. And I know that I'd seen the movie first. So the first time I picked up the book, I was actually quite surprised that the book was starting off in a first person point of view of the friend, of Dennis. Because, you know, it's about Arnie and his car. But then the middle part of the book is third person of all this other stuff that's going on, because Dennis has been taken out of the equation because he's been injured in a football game. And it's a really great structure for this book, because it does give you the point of view of the friend trying to save the situation. But there are other things that go on that you're going to have to be told that you can't be told from a first person point of view. So I think the structure of the book is really amazing and really fascinating, you know, and we even get a chapter in the book that's basically told from the point of view of the car, you know, and which is funny, because it's funny how memory plays with you, because I remembered a much larger section of the center of the novel being told from the point of view of the car. But when I read it again this time, it's only like 3 pages. You know, and it is that scene that you were talking about earlier where the car was chasing down and killing that one guy. And while it doesn't crush itself in there, it's still a very good adaptation of that scene, and a very close adaptation. But then when it comes to the movie, not only do I love John Carpenter, but I love this adaptation of the movie. And a lot of people complain about movie adaptations in that they don't hold up, because you got to take things out and they're not as good. And while I 100% agree that this is not as good as the book, I think it's a wonderful translation, because as a movie and how movies work, it gives you everything that you need Fine. In the movie, it's more the car than the previous owner. Fine. In the movie, they combined the two brothers together. And, with the owner, Raleigh, and his brother, George LeBay, they've combined those two characters together. And George LeBay has Raleigh's personality. But again, that's just to get rid of a character, because in a 2-hour movie, you get overwhelmed with characters and you can't follow it. But I think it's a great translation. And while it's not scary, and maybe it doesn't hold up as quite a horror movie in my 30s as it did when I was a teenager, it's still a wonderful, wonderful film, and I think a perfect translation and adaptation of the novel.
Well, and there are certainly moments in the film that I think are very cinematic and that kind of capture. I mean, the opening of the film, for example, where we do see the car kind of rolling off the production line, and as you said, one guy actually gets killed on the car production line. I think that's a great scene, and it really sets up the kind of nostalgia of that period of the kind of 1950s, because this is a story that basically takes place. Well, I think it takes place in 1978, maybe, but it was both the book and the film were released in 1983. I mean, this was a book that was in development as a film, I think, because Stephen King was on a bit of a high in more senses than one at this time, and so the book went under adaptation, before it had even been released. So the book came out in April, I think, and the film came out just before Christmas, sort of like December time. But a lot of it is tied to this kind of slightly twisted nostalgia for the 1950s. And I suppose, insofar as we think of when Stephen King writes horror, often it's, he'll take something seemingly kind of innocuous or even sort of friendly, like a clown or something, and give it this kind of dark inflection. Definitely that's an element of what's going on in this book, is we think of the 1950s as quite wholesome, as quite kind of safe almost, compared to, well, certainly today, and from the perspective of these stories, the kind of late 70s, early 80s. But here the nostalgia has this kind of real sinister kind of edge to it, and the book, I think he quotes a lot from song lyrics. There are song lyrics at the head of each chapter, I think, and in the film, one of the things that I thought worked very effectively in the film that actually is almost impossible to capture in the novel is how sinister this, quite kind of innocent 1950s music, which is on the stereo in the car. Basically, one of the quirks about this car is it will not pick up anything other than kind of golden oldies stations. Basically, it only plays old music. And there's a great scene in the film where I think Lee is leaving Dennis's house, and Arnie turns up, and she's aware of it because you hear this music coming out of the car, and that's your kind of first instinct that Christine is around, is this kind of, slightly kind of syrupy 50s music. And I think that is very effective in there. And weirdly, I suppose, with Voyager, I mean, you're right, it was an obvious transition for Tom Paris, because of course Tom Paris is obsessed with the 1950s. He does have the kind of Grease Monkey program, he does have the jukebox, and they do mention the jukebox in the episode. Actually, that's what pays for the shuttle, is Tom Paris's collection of like old 1950s music, which is a nice kind of touch. But at the same time, of course, the shuttle he buys is not a 1950s car. It's a futuristic spaceship. So it's kind of like, I don't know, again, I sort of feel like, yes, it makes sense that they translate it to his character, but then there's no way that they can translate across the vehicle itself, which is so much of what Christine is about. And if you read the book, you get this very strong image of this car. If you watch the film, I mean, the car, aside from anything, is absolutely beautiful. Do you know what I mean? And that does come across on screen. As much as it's this homicidal, evil monster, it's a gorgeous piece of design. It's a beautiful kind of piece of engineering. And there's a certain amount of kind of visual pleasure just in the car, in the film, I think. In the Voyager episode, the first thing Paris says, he says it's like a work of art, that shuttle. And you look at it, I don't know about you, I look at it, it's like, if I'm taking out my Eagle Moss subscriptions, that's not the month I'm looking forward to. It's a pretty nondescript. And it also it looks almost like a Federation shuttle. I mean, it's supposed to be this kind of exotic alien shuttle, and it's just, pretty nothingy, I'd say. So I kind of feel like that's something that the Voyager episode, they could have at least, if they'd made that shuttle look really kind of sexy and really kind of interesting and strange and alien, then that might have captured something, or even made it kind of, I mean, I don't know how you make a futuristic shuttle have that kind of retro appeal, but I think they could have done a bit more with the design there, because so much of what we're kind of asked to buy into, both with the film of Christine and in some ways with the novel when we're imagining it in our heads, is about the kind of the wonder of this vehicle and what also, what does a car represent for an American teenager, and this whole kind of nostalgia around the 1950s and everything. And so obviously they can't translate that kind of directly across, but maybe they could have tried to capture a bit more of the kind of charm that goes along with Christine, as well as this kind of sinister undercurrent.
Mm-hmm. See, that's kind of the interesting thing, because we look at this Voyager ship and we're like, this thing is ugly. And we're told multiple times in the book about how this is such a terrible car and this wasn't a popular car that people didn't like. But when we get to see it on screen, it really truly is a beautiful car. And even in the film, Will Darnell's like, guy's really good with his hands, but he's got terrible taste in cars. You know, like they even say that in there. So like people are talking about how this is not a nice car. This is not a popular car. It's not a good looking car. But when we see it on screen, it is. She's gorgeous, you know, and I don't know why the characters say that and why it's thought to be not a very nice car. But I mean, like even there, the interesting thing is the type of car that he's chosen, you know, it's a Plymouth Fury, right? Like, and fury means anger, you know, rage.
And the
like,
Furies are also like the beings in the underworld, aren't they? That come up and kind of cause mayhem and pursue men, and you know. So there's a sort of supernatural hint even in that word, I think. There.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that aspect of it myself.
This is where we should have Clara on the show now. But the Furies, I think don't they come up in Greek mythology from the underworld, and they pursue men who have, you know, betrayed their wives or done. I think that they're connected with a kind of vengeful idea of like punishing the guilty and that kind of thing. You get pursued. I may be wrong. You get pursued by the Furies. Even if I am wrong, they're broadly speaking, they are kind of demonic sort of spirits or kind of monsters in a way. So I hadn't even thought of that connection, but you're right. You know, fury as in like naked rage, but also that kind of supernatural element. And the naked rage is something that does come across because, you know, Arnie, for example, there's a scene where this sort of human antagonists, the school bullies, basically, who've got it in for him, they decide to go and trash his car, and they smash it up completely, and they even perform an unmentionable act on the dashboard, which is the most kind of
they poop on it.
Disgusting. They poop on it. Yeah, they poop on it. There's another word that occurs frequently in the book, but that we can't use, but that is interesting because it's one of these things that kind of ties into the sort of general feel of the book. There's a word that Roland Le Bay uses to describe people who he doesn't like. Poopers, we might poopers, translate it as, and Arnie starts using it, and it becomes this kind of sinister thing of like, you know, where has he picked up this word from? Why is he talking like this? But yeah, so there's that scene there, and his reaction is absolutely one of fury, you know, of absolute rage, of kind of, you know, a scary level of anger, you know, even for someone whose car that he spent months working on has been trashed. But somehow it goes beyond that. He's kind of almost lost his mind at that point. I think that comes across quite well in the film as well. That sort of, that what they've done is it's activated something in him that the car has kind of put him in touch with somehow.
Mm-hmm. And that's the interesting thing, is that they both the film and the book work in their unique ways. Like, it's, you know, where does he get this attitude from? Because, you know, George LeBay has all this anger in him when we meet him. But again, in the book, that's all the character traits of Roland LeBay. And so in the book, it's interesting that it's Roland LeBay's soul, but in the movie it works just fine that it's the car that's possessing him, and he's getting all these traits from the car, and the car passed the traits on to Roland, and then after Roland died, passed it on to George, and after George died, or after Arnie bought it from George, they passed it on to Arnie, you know, and so it works in its own medium and translates well in that way, you know, and you know, some of the stuff that you're talking about, like with the condensing of the plot, works really well. Like, yes, these people beat up this car, and in the book, the car just kind of heals itself. But we get this awesome scene in the book where the car almost performs this kind of a striptease dance in front of Arnie to repair itself. And Arnie is watching the car repair itself. And, you know, that kind of thing isn't quite so blatant in the novel, but it works really well in the movie, along with John Carpenter and Alan Howarth's amazing score, right? Like, you know, it's such a John Carpenter score for a John Carpenter film, but it translates very well, and it works in its own way, which just doesn't translate to Alice, unfortunately, because music is such an important part of the movie. And again, this is more based on the movie, and they do some amazing stuff with the music in the movie. Like, the transition in going from the 50s to the 70s is the same song by different bands. and you can hear the 50s tone of it so you know where you are, and you can hear the 70s tone of it so that you know where you are. And then, certain things happen, like somebody's trying to break into the car and a song comes on, you keep on knocking, but we can't get you in, whatever the lyrics are exactly. So the car itself is controlling the radio station in the film, picking the songs that are being played to convey its emotions, almost like Bumblebee and Transformers. So it's using music to convey its own emotions through the car, which is really kind of interesting. So.
And there's also in the film, there's a great use of the song Bad to the Bone, both at the very beginning of the film and at the end. And I mean, if anything's going to sort of underscore this idea that as far as the filmmakers are concerned, Christine is just an evil vehicle, and it's kind of from its inception, that's there at the beginning. It's bad to the bone, and then it
something
kind of comes
very
back.
Interesting about that, Duncan, is while that has become such a cliche thing to use that song in a movie, this was actually the first movie to ever use this song because it just came out. And John Carpenter snatched up the rights immediately. So this is the first movie to ever use Bad to the Bone to apply it to a character, in this case, the car.
That's interesting. That is interesting. Well, I mean, I think it's very effective, and also, so when was that song released then? Around
83.
the time of 83. But it has that kind of, it does have that sort of rock and roll feel, right? So I suppose there's that element of, when we think about the 50s, so there's the kind of schmaltzy, syrupy music, but there's also the kind of, if you think about the 1950s, there's the kind of fear of the teenager. Do you know what I mean? If you're not one of the teenagers, there's the kind of the fear of the gangs, or the kind of the real like rock and roll side of it, with the kind of motorbikes and and in this case the big cars or whatever. And I think there's a kind of interesting element in talking about the kind of way that nostalgia is used both in the book and the film, and maybe not so much in this episode, but certainly in Voyager more generally. The characters in Christine are explicitly based on characters from Happy Days. And Happy Days, of course, was again a show that was made in the 70s, I guess, but harking back to the 50s into that kind of nostalgia, because the main character is called Arnie Cunningham. Obviously, Richie Cunningham is the guy in Happy Days. And there's this kind of idea of these sort of archetypes, I suppose, the kind of, Arnie's the more sort of preppy, a bit of a sad sack really to begin with in this story. His friend is a bit more like he's on the football team, is a bit more of the jock. He's kind of not, maybe he's not quite the Fonz, but he's kind of in that sort of direction. But really that's the transition that Arnie makes, is that he ends up being the cool kid with like the leather jacket and the kind of, going from the kind of preppy sort of innocent 1950s model to this kind of bad boy model, the kind of teenager that everyone's a bit sort of intimidated by or afraid of. And I suppose there's that element, and maybe this is another reason why it possibly struggles to translate to Voyager, is it's very much a story about teenagers. And it's very much, yes, it's a story about teenagers in the 1980s or the late 70s or whatever it is. But at the same time, it's very much influenced by the idea of the teenager as something that emerged in the 1950s and as something that was, both empowering for that generation, but also very threatening to other generations. And a lot of the kind of conflict in the novel, aside from the car itself, is between, Arnie and his parents, for example, who disapprove of it. And I wonder whether that's another reason that it sort of struggles to translate to Voyager, because as much as they're, with Tom Paris, okay, maybe season 1 Tom Paris, we might say he was a bit like a teenager. He was kind of rebellious. He was a bit of a troublemaker and so on. By this point, Tom Paris is a kind of, he's pretty respectable. He's kind of, he's sorted himself out. But there's this kind of tendency to see it as teenage rebellion. So, to see Janeway as the disapproving mum, to see Chakotay as the kind of slightly cautious but ultimately indulgent dad, because there's this scene at the beginning where Paris is basically saying, can I get the shuttle? Can I get the shuttle? And Chakotay's sort of, talking him through it like a sort of very much like the dad, basically saying, well, yes, if you speak to your mother and, we can kind of, come to an agreement or whatever, but kind of making sure he doesn't take it too far. And then Alice herself in her kind of human form talks to him about sneaking around, I think, which is exactly what you think of teenagers as doing, kind of sneaking around. But at the same time, Tom Paris is not a teenager. He's in a committed adult relationship by this point. So I think there's this sort of weird element of, are they trying to kind of, is it basically setting him back to like season 1 Paris? And it's very reminiscent of that, that arc early on in Voyager where actually he was kind of going undercover or whatever, but they were setting up this idea that he was always late. And in this episode, he's late for duty. He kind of wasn't wearing the right uniform. In this, I can't remember if he did that the first time. In this episode, anyway, Chakotay says, you better shave and put your correct uniform on. In this episode, it even is revealed he started stealing parts for the work that he's doing. So all of this seems to be a way of kind of trying to drag Paris back to the kind of bad boy archetype of Paris that we started off Voyager with, which is, of course, so far away from where we are now with Paris. So there's a kind of real confusion, I suppose. Is it just like, would this shuttle have had this effect on anybody, and that it had made them behave badly and, screw over their friends and their girlfriend and everyone and lie to people? Or is there some sense that it's kind of, it had to be Paris because Paris is the one who, as much as his character has developed and as much as we've seen him change over these 6 years by this point, or whatever it is, that somehow he has the potential within him to just be that same guy who, and he sort of references it because he names her Alice after a girl who rejected him at the academy. So again, he's kind of, he's associating the shuttle with his youth and with his kind of, we've seen what Paris is like in season 1. We can imagine at Starfleet Academy, he was a real, pretty awful piece of work, So it's kind of, it's almost kind of put him back in that box somehow. And I don't know whether that's sort of, whether we buy that or not, because it's like, is this kind of alien influence enough for us to sort of undo 6 years worth of character development on this character and to kind of just say, okay, fine, this is kind of season 1 Paris that we're seeing from now on for the rest of this episode.
Yeah, it doesn't quite translate well, and I think that you're right. Like, it kind of had to be Paris because, I mean, if it's Harry Kim, like, he doesn't have a girlfriend to be like betraying and whatnot, right? So it's unique to him, and then it's not really clear why this is all happening in the book, except that we get this program in there. And had he not seen the shuttlecraft on screen, he wouldn't have bought it. In the book and the movie. In the book, it's not really clear why it's Arnie, in that, like, when Raleigh puts the car up for sale in the book, he just puts it up for sale. He brings it out of his garage, he sets it up on his property and puts a sign on it. He doesn't advertise it or anything like this. It's just there. And just because Dennis happens to take that route home, Arnie sees the car and basically Christine attracts him in the car. And again, it's not clear as to why that happens in the book. In the movie, you can say, hey, it's because the car is haunted and it grabbed him with its own personal spirit kind of thing, right? Like its own personal haunting grabbed Arnie in that way. And in the book, it's not quite clear. But it doesn't, like a couple of things that you were saying there, like it doesn't work because, yes, in the book and the movie, it is all about teenagers. Teenagers are associated with this certain kind of rage and rebellion. They're not the most respectful of people. So all of these hauntings that are happening to him, parents have described their kids as, I don't even know who you are anymore when they get in arguments with their kids. Well, in the book, it's directly, he's haunted, right? He's haunted by this other person's spirit. So the parents don't understand it, and they're just blowing it off as teenage changes. But in the book, it's a ghost, right? So, and that just doesn't translate to Tom Paris and that character. So
the other thing that I wonder about is whether the use of an actress to play the kind of human version of Alice in some ways lessens the impact of the idea of this kind of supernatural vehicle. I mean, I think if Stephen King had done that, or if John Carpenter had done that, it would have completely killed those stories. And I do wonder whether, I understand the necessity of it because he can't just be in the shuttle bay the whole time and you have to have some form of communication to like put on screen. But at the same time, I don't know, I feel like that kind of, it sort of makes it seem a bit bland somehow. And I wonder whether, I mean, one way they could have gone with it would be more to kind of, we had this idea of late at night, this kind of voice calling to him. I mean, the novel in particular, one thing that I think that John Carpenter could have made more of in making the film, and I appreciate, the novel is very large. It's kind of a bit bloated. There was a lot that had to be cut out to turn it into a film. There's a lot of stuff in the novel that is kind of, it's very interesting dreams. There are a lot of kind of nasty dreams that people have. And there's a kind of ambiguity. Are they just having these dreams because they're sort of freaked out by what they're witnessing in their real life, or is the dream itself almost being kind of a symptom of the presence of this kind of malign evil thing? And a lot of the characters, they have this, there's one of the things I think is really fascinating about the novel is this suspicion of the evilness of the car that they almost can't bring themselves to articulate. So they feel it. They know that something is going on. They know that something is wrong. They know that he can't really fix this car up the way that he's saying he has without there being something kind of supernatural about it. But no one will really dare say it. And it kind of comes out in their dreams. So Lee, for example, the girlfriend, has a dream where the car tries to kill her, I think, or is menacing her. And then, of course, in real life, in the story, the car does indeed try to kill her. And there are also these kind of weird chapters where there's a kind of sense of, you know, there are literal dreams, and then there's also this amazing sequence where Arnie and Dennis go for a ride in the car, this kind of late night ride in the car, and they have this bizarre sort of phantasmagoric experience where there are all the people who've died in the car, their sort of ghosts are there, these kind of hideous kind of dead bodies, basically, because several people have died in the car, including a little girl, the daughter of the previous owner. And they also have this weird kind of thing where they're driving through the town and they're seeing the town as it was in the 1950s rather than as it is in the present day. And so I think the book manages to get a lot of mileage out of, so to speak, sorry, pardon the pun, gets a lot of mileage out of this kind of idea of the sort of the boundary between reality and fantasy, and between fear and terror, you know, the fear of something and the kind of rational idea of, well, you know, this is what could really be happening. And to some extent, I think the movie just kind of sidesteps that a bit for the sake of brevity. And I don't think the Voyager episode really engages with that at all, because, I mean, all we get is, say, B'Elanna says, I think that thing tried to kill me, and people sort of laugh at her. And then she goes to Janeway, and Janeway's quite unsympathetic when B'Elanna says, basically, Tom's behaving really weirdly. I think there's something sinister going on. And Janeway just says slightly kind of dismissively, oh, you know, you guys are always fighting, you know, basically implying that B'Elanna's overreacting. And it's only when, of course, it, you know, being Janeway, when there's, and it being Star Trek, when there's a kind of scientific element, like, oh, this shuttle has this neural interface, then she's like, oh, okay, fine, neural interface, it can be affecting how someone's behaving or whatever. So, of course, there's also the element that, you know, Star Trek, it's not really a magical thing, it's a kind of scientific thing. And that's how people can come to accept, okay, his brain's being interfered with. So in a kind of Star Trek sense, that's how we understand someone being coerced or being under the kind of influence. But one of the things that I think is one of the real strengths of the novel is this kind of creeping awareness that actually nearly everyone comes to the same conclusion about this car after being in its presence for a certain amount of time, or after witnessing the effect on Arnie, but no one can bring themselves to speak of it because it's so irrational and it's so kind of, they don't want to be thought mad. Until, you know, quite late in the novel, where Dennis, the best friend, and Lee, the girlfriend, or the ex-girlfriend from this point, get to a point where they're able to kind of share their feelings about this thing that's happening and actually be able to talk about it openly. And this kind of is tied in as well with the two of them becoming closer, and then this kind of element of betrayal that takes place, you know, which is why, as I say, there's like two love triangles in this story. There's the two guys after the same girl, and then there's the, you know, two girls after the same guy, in a sense, you know, the human girl and the female car that seems to be very possessive of him.
Yeah, I think you're right there in that you've kind of hit it on the head there, hit the nail on the head, that people sense it, but they don't want to talk about it in the book because it doesn't make any sense. No, this car can't fix itself. You know, yeah, fine. It doesn't make any sense how he's repairing this car, but that's not enough for any type of suspicion. Yeah, I get a bad feeling about this car, but I mean, what does that really mean? And you know, they clearly sense something in this car which is affecting them deeply, and that's what's causing the dreams. And that doesn't translate in the film because of a length of time, you know.
The other thing I'm kind of wondering about is whether, I mean, when I was reading this book in particular, and I think it comes out in the film, is just thinking about what does this car kind of represent, or what does having a car represent? Because it's also, for Arnie, it's his first car. You know, there's this big thing about it being freedom from his parents. I mean, and obviously, you know, particularly in America, in a country which is so large, where to a large extent you kind of need a car to get around, but there's also this kind of real romanticization of the open road and getting out there and, you know, burning up the road and kind of speed and power in these cars. I mean, like, you know, when I say this car is beautiful, it's beautiful. It's also huge, certainly by European standard. You know, the cars we have over here, our roads are smaller and our cars tend to be much smaller. So you see these kind of massive American cars, particularly of that era, and they are quite kind of imposing. And I think, you know, and in terms of shooting the car, there are things you can do, you know, try and shoot it from down low and make it kind of look bigger and make it look imposing. These are also things that I think the Voyager episode never really tries to do with the shuttle. But there's also...
Well, the thing with cars, though, as well, like, it is a sense of teenage freedom, you know, and it is that one of those final hurdles almost in becoming an adult and a grown-up is having your own vehicle, right? And so, again, it plays off of that trope of, like, I don't know who my child is anymore because, you know, they're growing up and, you know, the parents, Arnie's parents don't want him to grow up. And the attitude that they have is a very controlling attitude for his life. He's a good boy. They've kind of been able to control his life up until now. And he's reached the age where they can't quite control him anymore. And so, again, that element of the book is it a haunted car or is it just somebody growing up? Is it a haunted car or is it just he's bought a car and now he's one step closer to being an adult? And he's going to be going away to college, but, you know, having the car means he can go anywhere, right? And so the parents don't have that control over him. If he has that freedom to just hit the road and go. You know, I remember the freedom of having my own car, and believe it or not, I actually had a Plymouth Fury. It wasn't a 58, right?
No way.
It was a 73, but yeah, my first car was a Plymouth Fury, and the movie was part of the reason why. When I saw that for sale, it was a cheap car. I paid like $500, $300, something like that for it. It was in really
Brandon,
good shape.
you really didn't take the message of this movie. You went out and bought one of those cars.
It was yellow. It wasn't red, you know, so.
Who knows? Someone might have sprayed it. Well, I think there's also this element of like, that does come across in a way in the Voyager episode, because there's one of the quite nice scenes, I think, in the Voyager episode is where Paris talks to Alice about his first experience flying a shuttle. And he talks about this, and he was 8 years old, I think, and his father took him up in a shuttle and let him, you know, take the controls. And it's almost, I mean, although I said that Voyager is kind of unable to deal with the kind of sexual side of this story, the way he tells it almost sounds like a story about losing his virginity, that, you know, and having this kind of freedom and becoming an adult and becoming, you know, this sort of powerful person. And also that, I suppose the idea of nostalgia is there, because what he says is he said he felt like he was flying and he's tried his entire life to recapture that feeling and it's never been the same again. So even flying Voyager through the Delta Quadrant, even flying the Delta Flyer, you know, we know that Paris is so identified with that kind of idea of being the pilot, of the kind of freedom of being the one at the helm, of kind of, and we know that he's a genius at it, you know, that he's kind of faster than anyone else, he's more skillful than anyone else, he's kind of, you know, he's like a Formula One racing driver, basically, of Starfleet. But that at the same time, the reason he's kind of pushing that his whole life is to try and recapture something that he can never get again, because it can never be his first time again, somehow. And so I suppose that is an interesting element that I think does kind of land in the episode. I mean, we've been quite negative about this Voyager episode, and I have to say, I don't think it's a very successful Voyager episode, but there are things in there that are nice. There are elements in there that work, you know, either in terms of lifting from Christine and the kind of pleasures that you were saying you derive from that, from seeing things that are kind of familiar up there on the screen, but also, you know, there are elements in that episode that work well, even if as a whole it doesn't quite kind of hang together. And I have to say, I enjoyed watching it more this time, having read the book and having seen the film with Christine. I guess it just gave me a different perspective on the Voyager episode, and it gave me new things to look for. And I did sort of, you know, get more out of it in a way. Contrary, really, to what Brian Fuller was saying about them having lifted too much. You know, I mean, maybe that's true. I think they certainly could have done a more interesting version of this storyline, even on Voyager, than they ended up with. But I mean, for me, it definitely, it didn't hurt the enjoyment of it. Sometimes I think when Star Trek borrows from something and you go back to the original and then you watch the Star Trek version, it's actually kind of disappointing, because you realise that what seemed quite original and interesting and kind of surprising is essentially just a rip-off.
Yeah, I think that's the case most of the time. You know, like with the ones that I said earlier, comparing Dawn to Enemy Mine, Dawn is a pale comparison of Enemy Mine, because Enemy Mine is a masterpiece. You know, Marauders to Magnificent Seven. I mean, while Magnificent Seven itself is a remake of Seven Samurai, I mean, Marauders is a pale comparison of even Magnificent Seven, which is a masterpiece. And that's the interesting thing, but it's fun to see what they were trying to do. But the limitation of a 45-minute episode really ties their hands in what they can do and how they can adapt that story. So, yeah, you know.
It's partly the 45 minutes. It's also just partly it being Voyager, I think, and the kind of formula of Voyager and the kind of tone of Voyager is in a way a bit of a mishmash. I mean, you've got this weird situation where you've got someone like Brian Fuller, who, as we see from a lot of his work, is interested in quite dark, often quite gory, quite sort of grisly stuff. You've got at that time Brannon Braga running Voyager, who again we know is interested in quite dark, sort of twisted, psychological, very interested in horror. And yet at the same time, when they try to kind of bring all that to the table, taking a source material which is quite grisly, is quite horrific, is quite kind of scrungy and interesting, somehow it doesn't quite make it across. The other thing I think the Voyager episode really lacks, that you get in both the book and the film of Christine, is a really satisfying ending where the car is just smashed to pieces. And I think in a way you need that. I think, you know, and in the book, it comes out slightly differently in the book and the film, but basically the story ends with a big showdown, and you've got Lee and Dennis who are using some kind of huge vehicle. In the film, it's like a kind of forklift truck or something, I think, isn't it? And in the book, it's like a
digger in the film.
It's a digger, right? Okay. Anyway, like a large vehicle that ought to be easily a match for a sort of standard automobile, but at the same time, Christine really gives them a run for their money. You know, it looks like Lee's going to get killed at one point. It's quite tense the way it's written, and I think the way it comes across on screen is quite tense as well, given that it's in some ways a ridiculous concept. But you definitely get an element of kind of catharsis and pleasure in just seeing that car smashed to pieces after everything that you've been through. That, you know, in the Voyager episode, we don't get that. We just get, you know, like we've seen a million times in Star Trek, a shuttle kind of breaking up and falling to pieces, and then we move on and it's almost like it never happened. And I guess that's the other element is, you know, and with the Voyager, again, it ends with Janeway saying, set a course for the Alpha Quadrant, like very brisk, very like, let's just put this behind us. This never happened, you know. It's almost, don't need to think about it. Whereas I think certainly the book of Christine, there's quite a lengthy section towards the end about, you know, how they went on with their lives and how they kind of never quite got over this experience. And, you know, he reads something in the newspaper about something that
the one guy that got away.
Yeah, exactly. You know, exactly. Something kind of that makes you think maybe the car wasn't really completely destroyed enough. And even if it was, the fact that they're kind of living with this, and he and Lee have kind of, you know, they're no longer in a relationship, and he's trying to write to her, and doesn't he writes to her and says something like, you know, how do you manage it? Basically, this kind of trauma, really post-traumatic stress in a way of having gone through all of this. Also, the story in the book is darker insofar as more people die. I mean, there's a lot more kind of collateral damage in the book than in the film. So Arnie dies in both instances, but in the book, his whole family is killed as well. And it's very much, there's this emphasis on like, they're kind of trying to save him, but at a certain point they can't save him because he's been kind of taken in too far by this evil force. Obviously, that's not going to happen with Voyager and Tom Paris. Tom Paris is going to come out of it. He's going to be completely fine the next week. Him and B'Elanna are not going to even really barely register it as a kind of ripple in their relationship. You know, everything is going to kind of reset to the sort of status quo.
Yeah, Tom and B'Elanna will be fine. Oh, that crazy shuttle that messed you all up. You remember that time? Mm-hmm. Yeah, that thing happened. But, you know, you mentioned that letter that he writes to Lee in the book, and her response is a postcard of like, deal with what? He asks her, how are you dealing with it? And her response is, all it is just deal with what? You know, or something brief like that. And it's like, it's interesting because you can interpret that so many ways. Has she completely forgotten about it? But my interpretation, because it's the postcard as a response and it just says deal with what, she's like, I'm choosing to put this behind me and I'm choosing to not acknowledge it anymore. That's how I interpret her response in the book. It's there and she's not dealing with it. But because she simply sent this postcard saying deal with what, that's her saying, I'm choosing to go on and be strong in my life.
Well, who knows? Maybe that's what happens on Voyager week by week. Is it's not that there's no continuity. It's not that they forget that things happened. It's just that everyone is like rigidly choosing to move forward. Yeah, exactly. That could be the show's kind of like tagline: "Deal with what." But but I don't know. I feel like, you know, as I say, maybe we've been a little bit harsh on this Voyager episode. Maybe there are people who are big fans of Alice, and you know, if you are, get in touch with us. You know, hit us up on the Babel conference. Let us know why you think that episode succeeds on its own merits. But, you know, it's interesting. I think it's always interesting when Star Trek borrows from, you know, whether it's history or culture or film or literature or whatever. Obviously, that's what this show is all about. And certainly this is one of those examples where the borrowing is very explicit, really, where they basically just took the idea, okay, let's do Christine on Voyager, and this is kind of what they came up with. And, it's always interesting to see how that plays out and how some things do translate better than others.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. And I'd like to hear people, if you haven't seen Christine, go back and watch the film and check it out, because it is fun. I mean, we've spoiled the movie for you. We've spoiled the book for you. We've talked a lot about it, but it's still a fun comparison to have. And it still is, in my opinion. I know that you said you didn't agree with me, but I think it's a 5-star film. And I think it's a great masterpiece of 80s cinema. And it's a classic, and it's one of those horror films that shaped my preferred film watching, my film watching experiences.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't dislike it as a film. I thought it was a good film. I don't know, maybe if I'd seen the film first, I would have responded more to the film and then gone back to the book and seen the book as kind of all the extra baggage and the kind of deleted scenes and the kind of bump around it. Whereas obviously for me going into it, not really knowing much about it, I loved the book. But I have to say, both the book and the film were trashed when they were released. I mean, it wasn't just John Carpenter who wasn't happy with the film. A lot of people didn't like that film. It kind of, I think, has become more of a kind of cult classic in later years. But initially, it wasn't a big hit. The book, I mean, I think it had I read quite a positive review in the New York Times when it was first published. But a lot of people hated it. And even now, kind of retrospectively, a lot of people see it as kind of Stephen King's first real failure and are quite harsh on it. I mean, things like, for example, the structure that you were saying you found quite interesting, where the narrator switches like a third of the way through the book. Apparently, Stephen King admitted basically he only did that because he wrote himself into a box and he realized he couldn't tell the next bit of the story with the narrator that he'd intended to use for the book. And so he kind of just, flipped it. And, in the next chapter, it's narrated by some kind of unknown, more sort of general narrator. And I have to say, when I was reading it, I was a little bit put off by that. I sort of thought, wow, that's an unusual decision. I mean, it didn't really bother me. There were lots of things like that in the book that didn't maybe quite add up, didn't quite make sense, seemed a little bit of a shortcut or whatever. But I kind of just went with it and really enjoyed the went along for the ride. When you strap yourself into this mad, slightly depraved vehicle and just go where it takes you, So I would say recommend, definitely, go and watch the film, but I would recommend going back to the book as well and see what you think. And, maybe it does have its flaws, but it does also just have that quality of real, if you like Stephen King's kind of approach to horror and so on, I think there's a lot of that. It's got that in spades. And I mean, I have to say, I didn't read it I think you got hold of an old paperback, didn't you? I was actually listening to it on Audible because I generally do a lot of my reading these days as audiobooks rather than actual books, just because I have more time to listen than I have to read. And I think I said to you at some point when we were, talking about this when I was listening to it, I think Stephen King is probably the best writer for audiobooks of anyone. And that sounds like I'm kind of damning with faint praise, but there's something about the way that he writes that if you get a good narrator in there to read it, it gets into your brain and it gets into you. Do you know what I mean? It's sort of in a way that reading it on the page, I'm not saying you can't have that experience reading it on the page, but I started getting slightly freaked out by this novel, partly from, I'd be listening to it while I was walking the dogs around the block, and you suddenly start, looking around at every car that's parked up on the curb and thinking, I don't know, it gets into your mind somehow, partly because I think it has all these weird dream sequences, because it's got this idea of like questioning your sense of reality and so on. So I would say, as much as it is a bit of a bloated book, as much as it is a bit of an odd one, there's a lot in there that's, well worth taking a look at.
So you didn't know about this book at all before I brought this topic to you?
I'd never heard of it.
Oh, wow. That's crazy.
No, and I'd seen the Voyager episodes probably 2 or 3 times, I guess. I mean, most recently in 2016 when, I was doing the rewatch as well. But it didn't cross my mind that it was based on something else then until you brought it to me, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. I'll go and check that out. So thank you, Brandon, for, getting in touch and suggesting this. And, it's always great to have suggestions for new topics, because there are, 700 and something Star Trek episodes, and a lot of them have some kind of antecedent that is well worth delving into. And, the more so in a way, if like me, it's something that you're totally unfamiliar with, it gives you a new insight, new kind of perspective on Star Trek, which is kind of what we're always going for. So Thank you for suggesting that, Brandon. Thank you for coming on the show to talk to me about it. Before we go, do you want to just give our listeners a little rundown on where they can find you elsewhere on the Trek FM network, and if they want to get in touch on social media?
You bet. Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me on. I've been looking forward to it all summer. We've been planning this like quite a while ago, and like, which gave us time to read the book. Cause yes, like you say, it's a long book. You know, as I was reading this book, you know, I was thinking, like, I read a lot of Star Trek books because I follow along with Literary Treks, right? That's the show that I choose to support through Patreon. And, you know, a Star Trek book, I can read a page in under a minute for most of the Star Trek books that are out there. And, you know, this book's 500 pages, and it would take me about 2 minutes to read a page because the writing is small. There's a lot of writing on each page. So, I mean, like, I would put this one novel almost probably at the length of the Destiny trilogy. You know, like, you know, so it's a long book. There is a lot there. I really enjoy it. I think it's great. When I'm not driving around running people over in my Fury, you can find me on Twitter at Brandon Mutala. You can find me here on the network with a show called Melodic Treks, which is all about the music of Star Trek. I'm also a co-host of Warp 5 with Brandy and Patrick, and that's our Star Trek Enterprise podcast. And if you like films and you like cinema, we are also doing a series of films called Movie Night, where we're actually just talking about the movies that they mention on Enterprise that they are watching during movie night. So we've done For Whom the Bell Tolls, The Wages of Fear, Frankenstein, you know, so it's a lot of fun. Any movie that they mention on the show, we're going to be covering at some point, and we're just simply talking about the movie. Over on the Fandom Podcast Network, I've got a podcast called Good Evening, an Alfred Hitchcock podcast, which I do with my friends Chris and Tom. And once a month, we cover an Alfred Hitchcock film. We're doing those chronologically. Depending on when this comes out, as of this recording, today, our second episode, Zach and I from Standard Orbit are doing a podcast called Halloween H4O. And it's an 11-episode series on the Talk Film Society covering the Halloween films because the new one's coming out right away. And then I've also launched an intermittent podcast over on the Cinematic Sound Radio Network, which is called Breaking the Waves, and it's all about electronic film score. And as of now, there's only one episode. There's not going to be a lot of those. It's just like another creative outlet for me. But the first episode covers the Academy Award-winning duo of Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross. So it sounds like I'm doing a lot, but most of them are like kind of intermittent podcasts, and they're not regular ones.
Brandon, you have more fingers in more pies than my former co-host Tony Black, I think. And I think he must have had his toes in a few pies as well at one point. But that's a lot of podcasts to be listening to, but all well worth your time. So thank you again for joining me today.
It was a blast. Thank you very much.
Well, it's been fun tearing up the tarmac with Brandon this week, but looking into the darker recesses of Tom Paris's psyche isn't the only thing we've been doing on Trek FM this week. So here's a listen to some of the other stuff you might have missed out on the network.
Previously on Trek.fm. To the journey!
I love that Barclay says he's lost himself in Voyager because I have been there, man.
Haven't we all, Reg? Haven't we all?
It hits a little close to home.
It does.
I'm a little bit like Barclay in some ways. I have just a little bit of paranoia to me.
Awkward?
No, a little paranoid. No, I don't think I'm awkward.
No.
Okay, maybe a little bit.
Oh, you said you're like Barclay. Awkward.
Give me a glass of wine and I'm fine.
Okay.
Synthahol. Excuse me, Synthahol.
The 602 Club.
Well, and I think that there's even, a kernel of that conversation reflected in when he is on the airship with his dad. And it's very interesting because Indy gives, they give the two versions of the story where, you were distant, you didn't hang out with me, you didn't do these things, I didn't have a normal dad like every other kid. And then you hear, Henry Jones Sr. say, I never told you to wash behind your ears. I never checked up on your homework. I gave you all of the freedom and independence that you wanted. And if you were to ask any kid, they'd say that's what they wanted. And then you find out, to speak to the point about fact and truth, that that's not necessarily what you want. You want involvement. You want connection. You want to be together. You want to be part of your family unit. And you want it to be cohesive. I mean, at a baseline, that's what everybody wants.
Earl Grey.
And especially like toward the end when it's like, Jean-Luc, what are you and I doing just like voyaging around the galaxy by ourselves on this ship? Like, it makes perfect sense to you, but it makes no sense to me, right? Just the two of us like on this giant ship.
Well, like, when it was just a small skeletal crew, you know, and she's still questioning, it's like, why do we have all of these rooms and quarters? And then Data just nonchalantly, well, we have... You know, we need evacuation and we take diplomats around it. And like, he's listing it like, well, duh, this is why we have it. And Picard's like, that'll be enough, Data.
Warp 5.
Well, you remember what it was like when it was 42. You weren't very reasonable then, were you?
No, I was not. I was absolutely not. I was yelling at a tree in my backyard. It was not a pretty sight.
All I know is, big men in heat is not a good idea.
Oh, that sounds like a great band. Big men.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
Check out all these shows and join the conversation about your favourite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad, or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they are published.
And please leave us a star rating and a written review. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, in most third-party apps, and you can stream and download the MP3 file from our website or grab the RSS link.
We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways for you to do that. The best place is to join the larger conversation on the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type in Babel, B-A-B-E-L, into the search field on Facebook, and it should come right up.
If you'd like to send us an email, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. Choose to send to a show and select Primitive Culture. That'll come right to us. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM.
Primitive Culture is brought to you by Duncan Barrett and Clara Cook. You can find Duncan Barrett on Twitter at Barrett's Books. You can find Clara on Twitter at ClaraJeanMC.
If you'd like to help us keep all our shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/TrekFM. That's patreon.com/TrekFM to get all the details.
Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more, available through our special patrons website, Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month. We really appreciate any support you can give us, and hope you'll join the team. Again, you'll find all the details at patreon.com/TrekFM.
We'd like to take this opportunity to thank our associate producers here at Primitive Culture, Tony Black and Amy Nelson. Tony was one of the founders of this show, and we still keep him in the loop about what we're doing. You can find him on Twitter at @AJBlackWriter, and online hosting about a dozen other podcasts on everything from The X-Files to classic cinema. Amy is the host of 2 shows on the Trek FM network, Earl Grey and The Edge, and you can find her online on Twitter at Miss Amy Nelson.
You're blended, all right.